Hello and welcome to the Anaxa guide video. I'll be going over everything you need to know about Anaxa. I'm not going to be reading his abilities word for word because you can read all of that online. I'm going to explain how he should be played, and he is actually the most simplest DPS we have gotten in a while. Anaxa is basically Silver Wolf if she was AoE and useful. Before I say anything else, I want to point out a common misconception. Anaxa just implants the weakness type and doesn't reduce any damage res. His kit is surprisingly interesting because of his talent. His main objective and playstyle is to use his abilities to apply 5 different types of weaknesses to apply the qualitative disclosure state. The qualitative disclosure state enables Anaxa to deal 30% more damage to targets afflicted with this state. Another thing to add, after using his basic attack or skill on the debuff targets, he is able to launch his skill again without consuming any skill points, and this can be only used once on that same target. Another thing to add, after using his basic attack or skill on the debuffed enemies, he is able to launch his skill again without consuming any skill points, and this can only be used once on that target. However, if a target has been defeated before the attack, it will select a random target instead. In short, Anaxa's game plan is to apply 5 different weakness types on his enemies, and once that requirement is met, he is able to deal 30% more damage to those same targets, as well as launching a one-off additional skill whenever he casts his basic attack or skill. Bear in mind that this would refresh against new enemies, because thanks to his A6 trace, Anaxa is able to ignore 4% of the enemy's defense for every weakness they have, up to a maximum of 7 weakness implants. So besides Anaxa gaining 30% increased damage to enemies, he also ignores 28% of the enemy's defense if they reach maximum weakness. Now, Anaxa's skill is the bread and butter of his gameplay, and you should look to cast this ability most of the time. When casting this skill, 5 instances of 70% wind damage is dealt to the enemy. He's going to be dealing 350% wind damage in total because of this. The first instance of damage will be inflicted on the primary target. However, the next 4 would bounce to random enemy targets that have not been hit by his skill. Another detail to mention about his skill, after the skill has been used for each attackable enemy on the field, this skill has its damage dealt increased by 20%. So for example, if there's like 5 attackable enemies present on the field, then Anaxa has a skill damage increased by 100%. To put it into perspective, Anaxa is surprisingly a flexible unit. On the field with 5 enemies, Anaxa is able to guarantee that all enemies receive his skill's damage. In single target scenarios, Anaxa is able to guarantee 350% of his wind damage to his target only. This means he's able to thrive in any situation but doesn't excel in anything compared to characters like Castris, Facial, and Akron, who mainly dedicate themselves to AoE or single target damage. Anaxa's ultimate is what makes his skill so useful, because when you cast his ultimate, you apply the sublimation state. Now, what the sublimation state is that it pretty much applies all element weakness type onto those targets, which means that every target on the field is affected by this. Additionally, if the target doesn't have control res, then they're unable to take any actions if affected by the sublimation state. Similar to Huohuo, casting Anaxa's technique causes nearby enemies to flee away from Anaxa for 10 seconds. When entering battle, when an ally unit attacks an enemy afflicted with the terrified state, it will be considered as attacking an enemy's weakness type. Anaxa also applies one weakness of the attacker's type to every unit for 3 turns. So let's say I cast Anaxa's technique and attack with the Herta to enter into battle. By doing so, Anaxa will apply quantum weakness onto all enemy units for 3 turns. You basically want to use this technique to apply a weakness that isn't on the enemy, so bear that in mind. Onto Anaxa's basic attack, even though it isn't anything extraordinary, you do gain an additional 10 energy thanks to his A2 trace. And if there are no enemies afflicted by his qualitative disclosure state, then you're able to gain an additional 30 energy. This means if all enemies aren't carrying 5 weakness implants, then you will be gaining 60 energy, which is pretty beneficial to achieve your ultimate faster. For Anaxa's A4 trace, and I guess this kind of allows Anaxa to alternate between a secondary DPS or a full-out hyper carry. Depending on the number of erudition characters you're using in your party, you receive only one of the following effects. If you're running one other erudition unit in your party, Anaxa will gain 140% crit damage, which simply buffs him and him only. On the other hand, running 2 other erudition characters increases all allies damage by 50%. This includes Anaxa as well. There are actually some hypercarry teams you can use if you're considering going the hypercarry route, but I'll be covering more of that later on, so stick around. Before I say anything else, the stats you receive from leveling up Anaxa's minor traces is a 22% wind damage boost, 12% crit rate, and a 10% HP boost. Anaxa has a variety of options to choose from, whether you're running him as a sub DPS or hypercarry on your team. A 4-piece scholar is one of the many choices you you can choose from when building him. The 4-piece effect surprisingly goes well with his kit. Aside from his talent, his best abilities are his skill and ultimate. And because the 4-piece effect from Scholar, Anaxa deals 20% increased damage through his ultimate and skill, and an additional 25% after casting his ultimate. Now this effect is pretty useful because of how fast he can build up his ultimate. Remember that Anaxa has his skill damage increased by 20% for each attackable enemy on the field and can ignore up to 28% of the enemy's defense, so the damage you'll be dealing will be pretty high up if you meet his win condition. Another set worth using is Genius of Brilliant Stars. Genius is a pretty solid set because of his 4-piece effect. Despite Anaxa being a wind unit, that doesn't mean he's unable to apply quantum weakness to your enemy, so long as you have the Herter or Tribi in your party. Some of you are probably wondering what the 4-piece effect does for you. By having the set equipped on Anaxa, he's able to ignore 10% of the enemy's defense. However, Anaxa is able to ignore another 10% of the enemy's defense as long as the enemies are weak to quantum, which Anaxa can easily achieve through his technique, skill, and ultimate. Eagle of Twilight is another solid choice to go with since it enables Anaxa to run attack boots without messing up any speed action setups. The only downside is that this would require having a signature light cone to keep up with his energy needs as well as dealing decent damage to enemies. Pioneer's another great alternative too, not too far behind from Scholar when it comes to damage. So running this set really just comes down to your substats on these pieces. For planar ornaments, Azumo and Rutulent Arena are what I recommend. However, they have different uses. Azumo is mainly used for team comps where Anaxa isn't the hyper carry and serves as a DPS, so I would advise using this set if you're running with units such as the Herter. Now for Rutulent Arena, this is a staple set for hyper carry units, and that is exactly what you need if you want to go for that route. Besides giving Anaxa the extra 8% crit rate, upon having 70% or more of that, the damage he'll be dealing with his ultimate and skill will be increased by 20%. Obviously, this set is great for dealing more damage. There's not much to say about this since it's a universal set for hyper carry units. Anaxa's best free-to-play light cone is going to be the new event light cone, which you can get and fully superimpose from the anniversary event. This light cone was fully made for Anaxa. Besides receiving a 60% attack increase, the damage dealt by the wearer is increased by 8% for every weakness the enemy has, and this effect can be stacked 7 times. The crazy thing about this light cone, it is possible to max out its effect at the start of battle. In scenarios where there are multiple enemies with 2-3 weaknesses, Anaxa may already receive the light cone's maximum effect or maybe one attack away. On top of that, with how fast Anaxa builds his ultimate at the start of battle, you'll pretty much be gaining maximum value from this light cone pretty much all the time. For those considering pulling for a signature light cone, I would definitely recommend it if you're looking to use Eagle on him. The 10 extra energy gain helps him reach his ultimate faster, as well as putting out more damage when Anaxa applies a weakness implant onto an enemy by 60%, as well as decreasing the enemy's defense by 12% whenever he attacks. Obviously, even without the set, the light cone is still a great option. Whether you're unsure about pulling for his light cone or not, I'd say stick with this free-to-play option since it's almost comparable to his signature light cone. The only difference is the 12% extra defense decrease when attacking an enemy unit. Another noteworthy option, surprisingly, is the Hertis signature light cone. Obviously, I don't expect you to take away her light cone from Anaxa, but the option is there anyway. He's a crit DPS, so the crit rate buff isn't all bad. Besides that, Anaxa gets a 60% damage increase to his skill and ultimate for 3 turns when he casts his ultimate. Also, whenever he uses his ultimate, he recovers 1 skill point, which is pretty decent for gaining more SP in battle. Okay, let's talk about Anaxa's best Eidolons. His best Eidolon, in my opinion, is his E2. His E2 gives him the same amount of all-type res pen as Robin would. Anytime an enemy enters the battlefield, he implants a weakness type onto that new enemy. Bear in mind that this effect triggers every time a new enemy arrives. Now, compared to his E1, an extra skill point isn't anything too crazy. Although the 60% defense shred does seem appealing, all-type res pen actually deals more damage to enemy targets. However, this doesn't mean I wouldn't pull for his E1 at all. His E1 is actually pretty useful when pairing him with the Herter. Although the 60% defense shred does seem appealing, all-type res pen actually deals more damage to enemy targets. However, this doesn't mean I wouldn't pull for his E1 at all. In other words, his E1 is focused on being more supportive for his teammates to generate SP, whereas his E2 enables him to dish out solid damage on his own. Now, a comparison to pulling for his signature light cone, I would absolutely recommend pulling for this first before pulling for his Eidolons. The difference in damage between his E1 and S1 is pretty massive, since he gains increased damage and a 12% defense ignore. His E1, on the other hand, gives 1 extra skill point when using his skill for the first time in battle, which seems very underwhelming in my opinion. He also deals 60% defense shred whenever he casts his skill. Although the difference between 12 and 60% defense shred isn't that massive, Anaxa's light cone Hearthstone tops it off with 60% damage increase when an enemy has a weakness implanted by the wearer, plus the extra 10 energy whenever a Noxus turn starts. So basically the order you want to be pulling for these is after pulling for his E0, you should definitely pull for his E1, then pull for his Eidolons. The LDR pulling for his Light Cone enables him to serve as a support or hyper carry in your teams. Now for the very important part, his team comps. For hyper carry include himself, Sunday, Tribby and Linksha. This comp will be his best hyper carry team, but fear not, because even if you don't have these units, there are alternative options. This would include Sunday, Sparkle, Bronya or Remembrance MC. For this to work, you can either build these units to have 1 speed less than the main DPS and spam skill to drag them up, or build these units to have as much speed as possible to drag a Anaxa around, something which these characters can do through their skills. For your Tribute alternatives, Robin, Pella are pretty solid since they provide buffs and debuffs to the enemies. For those looking to build him as a sub DPS, he's compatible with Jade or the Herta with Tribby and Linksha as your support and sustain. As I mentioned previously, good alternatives for Tribby are Robin and Pella. For sustains, Linksha and whatever you have available to you is completely fine. Okay, that pretty much covers just about it. If you made it this far into the video, consider subscribing on your way out and let me know how your pulls went. With that being said, I'll see you in a bit.